Today's podcast is presented by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to monetize your podcast, providing podcasters with a flat rate for ad space so you always know how much you get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co at podgo.co. And when you go to apply and they ask you, how did you hear about Podgo? Make sure you tell them that the Vault Classic Music Review sent you.
Welcome to the Vault Podcast, Classic Music Reviews, presented by IV Creative. Now, here's your hosts, B. Cox and the crew.
Greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Vault Podcast, Classic Music Reviews, presented by IV Creative. It's a perspective on the classics from a fresh point of view. We appreciate you for taking your time and lending your ears to our perspective. You could be anywhere listening to anything, but you're right here with us, so we thank you. With you today is yours truly, B. Cox, and I'm flying solo because I'm doing something a little bit different this week. This week, we're going to give you a little bit of a treat. It's going to be the part of our, as we call it, our year-ending series. As you know, we're heading into the end of 2020, and for many of us, we cannot wait until it ends and cannot end soon enough for us to get to a new year with new possibilities. But we got to wrap this year up first. Today, we are going to do a bonus episode, a special edition of Cards, Dominoes, Drinks, and Smoke, and take you back 25 and 20 years ago. We're going to have a two-part episode. In the first part, I'm going to take you back to 25 years ago in 1995 and take you back into the journey of how things started with me as a lover of hip-hop music, how my journey started from me being a fan of hip-hop to being obsessed and the junkie of hip-hop, and that 1995 was the year that it all happened. So I'll go a little bit into the story of that year during that summer and some of the supporting characters who helped to latch me onto this addiction, which is now being a junkie of hip-hop music that has lasted for well over 25 years now. And the second part is going to go back 20 years to the year 2000. And we are going to take a specific look at 4 albums that really changed my outlook on music, 4 R&B, specifically 4 neo-soul albums that really changed my outlook at music at a critical time in my life. And we're going to take a look back, and we're going to take you on a journey back through my early college days as we take a look at 4 of the greatest R&B albums and in my mind, the 4 greatest neo-soul albums of all time, which of course I know we have some argument to tell you about how my love affair with that subgenre of music started as well. So sit back, relax. We're going to get into a throwback edition of Cards, Dominoes, Drinks, and Smoke. It's a doubleheader, and we're coming up with it right now. Part 1. My beginnings as a hip-hop junkie. Going back to the year of 1995. So I'm going to take you guys back on a little journey. Many of you, if you've been listening and been fans of this show, know that I'm a child of the early 80s. Came of age during the 90s and reached adulthood exactly in the year 2000 and became an adult in the 2000s. Listening to this show, you know that we do album reviews from 20, 25, and 30 years ago. So I'm going to go a little bit back into my background. Everybody knows, or most of you know, that we live in the D.C. area. I grew up in a suburb outside of Washington, D.C., and I grew up in a Caribbean household. My parents are both from the island of Grenada, and I grew up in a house with 3 older sisters. Growing up around that time, especially in the 80s, it was a little interesting because our household, when it came to music, had a lot of different sounds in it. So I can remember even from a young kid growing up and listening to things and hearing a lot of different music, specifically a lot of Caribbean music initially. Like I remember hearing a lot of music from Grenada, from Ajamu and Black Wizard. Also hearing old calypso music from The Mighty Sparrow, from Byron Lee and the Dragonaires. Hearing old reggae music from anything from Toots and Maytals to Marcia Griffiths to Dennis Brown to Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, a lot of different old Caribbean music. And that's my parents' style because that's the music that a lot of them grew up, not just as kids, but it also was adolescents and as young adults when they came here to the United States. Then I heard a lot of old school music, American old school music, classic R&B and soul music from the 60s and the 70s. You heard a lot of stuff from the Temptations, a lot of Marvin, Stevie Wonder, the classics, Anita Baker, Patti LaBelle. Eventually, things like Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson started to creep into that household at that time. And at this time, when I was a young kid, he was really starting to get towards the height of his popularity in the late 80s. This is around the time when the Bad album came out. But then as I got into school age, you started to hear music change a little bit. And how I got into hip hop really, and even has modern R&B as many of us knew it, when we grew up during the 80s and the 90s, that came from my older sisters. I had older sisters at that time. Both of them were, in high school, and then eventually at this point were in college. So I used to be with them a lot, running some errands and things. We always had the radio station on a cool radio station, so I like to stay. In our radio stations here in the D.C. area, 95.5 WPGC and 93.9 WKYS. Things like Wash FM and like 96.3 WHUR played old music. That was the music from my parents at that particular time, which is funny now because if you listen to 102.3 and 96.3 here, now it's music that I grew up with. We used to listen to those stations as we went out. I was introduced to a lot of the popular music and hip hop and that form of R&B when I started grade school. And spending time with my sisters, a lot of it at home, a lot of it was spent watching BET and MTV. So that was really my introduction into hip hop. A lot of this was late 80s, really a lot of Public Enemy, definitely some De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, not really as much as NWA because that wasn't really allowed in my household. That was like forbidden fruit. Those were one of the things that you had to sort of duck out at a party when everybody else was occupied and put the headphones on and grab a CD that your older sister or brother might have and go run and put it in and listen to it and then put it away before anybody catches you. It was the same type of thing. So that's really what it was in the late 80s. Going into the 90s, things started to change a little bit more for me. You started to get more into, seeing more acts, seeing that this is the time when Tupac came around. Eventually, Pete Rock and CL Smooth, from the late 80s into the 90s, Heavy D, Salt and Pepper. The thing that struck me in particular being from DC is that you had artists like Salt and Pepper and Kid and Play doing go-go sort of mixes with some of the bands, in particular EU. And everybody knows EU because they're the ones who did the one go-go song that everybody knows, which is Doing the Butt. So that sort of caught your attention as well. As you get into the 90s, you start to get more and more into and see how the music starts to change. To me, rap music and hip-hop music was really all about fun and partying and everything like that. And then when you saw some of the Death Row artists start to emerge, and then it was Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, it was about that, but it was from a different perspective. Like, to me, I never really was able to ascertain where rappers were from until I reached that point where I started seeing Death Row emerge with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and a Dog Pound. And it's like, oh, they're from California. It didn't really matter to me at that point because music was music. And you start to get into music more and more. At that point, once I'm into the 6th grade, all of my sisters are we're not in school with each other anymore. And I'm sort of starting to hang around my friends a lot more so than being around my sisters, because that's what boys do when they get older and they get through school. They get their groups of friends. You start to hang out. As 94 comes along and I'm out of the 6th grade, I get into and start middle school in 1994, the 94-95 school year. Going into middle school is when everything changed. Because for the first time in about 6 years, you went to school with a lot of people that you didn't know. There were a lot of folks from different neighborhoods. Some of them were and because of what we did here in Prince George's County in Maryland, we bused a lot of kids to different schools. So I went to school with a lot of kids who were probably, a lot further away than usually what would used to be when you have people within a community who go to a school, my middle school, which was in Bowie. And that changed because the older than now that you get, once you're out of the safety of elementary school, you're in middle school. And as things start to change, folks start to go through puberty, you looked at girls and liked girls before, but then by the time you get to middle school, that goes to another level when you look at girls, and then the interaction between guys and the things that you guys talk about from when you were elementary school to middle school, that changes too. Well, then the music started to change a lot during that time as well. And as a result, the music started to change, the video started to change, and the fashion started to change. When I got to middle school, as I tell myself, and anybody who has any budget frugal parents will tell you that when you get to a certain point, when fashion changes and your parents don't want to follow the trends and you go to school kind of looking not up to the fashion trends, that's when, especially in middle school, you get joked on, as we call it in DC, getting joned on, which I did a lot when I first got to middle school. It was wild. But when I got to middle school, things started to change. The music did. Bone Thugs and Harmony came out. And this was a style that a lot of people weren't really familiar with, that rapid style, rapid fire rapping style. And their influence on the culture, specifically where I was at in this part of the country, was huge. Because what you saw in 94 is that a lot of people started having cornrows and started wearing, more sports jerseys when they were in middle school, almost like they were emulating, like they were trying to look like members of Bone. Then also in 94, what also came out was Nas's Illmatic and Biggie's Ready to Die. You could see that started to have an influence. You also see other projects such as Dog Food by the Dog Pound, like Gangstar, things of that, and then other Digging in the Crates crew type of things starting to come out. And what started to happen during that time was that the marriage of hip hop and R&B was really starting to become evident. And that through the acts of folks like Mary J. Blige, and then also through like Aaliyah and Brandy, and eventually then Monica, how much things started to change, because you saw that now R&B itself now wasn't that classy thing that you saw that that our sisters and brothers used to listen to. It was starting to become definitely a lot more hip hop in its style. So on to the year 95. And into 95, you get into the end of the year. I'm getting ready to end my 7th grade year and head into the summer of 95, where I would end the 7th grade and then go into my summer break before I would start the 8th grade. Well, right around April of 95, and you started to see these promos for a new movie coming out with Ice Cube and Chris Tucker. That was Friday. Nothing else further needs to be said. But then you also see other movies starting to come up with promos during the summertime. And when you're in the movie industry, you know that the summer is where you're going to make your money, because kids are out. They are out of school. Most of them don't have jobs. But then this is really where you're going to make your money. You saw promos for movies like Dead Presidents, for Panther, for New Jersey Drive. As you got into the summer, you also saw promos for a movie like Clockers. So things really, all these movies that had recognizable faces in them, and then also sort of appealed to the hip hop generation because it's the type of themes that they had in those movies. So 7th grade year ends and the summer of 95 starts. And this is how my obsession with hip hop music began. It all began in a garage. Now, I know a lot of you who are listening to this right now are probably sitting and saying, wait, what do you mean your obsession with hip hop started in a garage? It started in a garage. So here's the story. I grew up in a neighborhood, and one of my best friends, his nickname, for the sake of this podcast, we'll call him Face, right? And it's just his nickname is Face. Me and Face grew up right across the street from each other. He was a couple of years older than me, and he was in the same age group as me and the youngest of my sisters. But we knew each other for quite some time. Now, Face was very much into hip-hop and music. His family was in the church, but then they also were from D.C., and he had a background where, they were very into music, and he was into hip-hop culture. Matter of fact, I credit him to really him being the one getting me to become a hip-hop junkie because of me hanging around him. And at this point, they were already in high school. So me and Face were sort of hanging around that summertime. And then two other guys who were friends of Face, the other ones, will give them this name for these purposes, Rome and then Black. Now, Rome and Face were classmates. They were part of the same high school class the same year. And Black was a guy around the neighborhood who had been to our high school, but he was sort of like an OG, a little bit older than the rest of us, but hung around us because he had been to school with Face and also with Rome. They used to come around almost every day in the summertime. Now, Rome, to give you a perspective, lived in a neighborhood right next to ours. That was, I would say, probably about 2.5 to 3 miles away. And he used to ride over there every day on his bike. This is how much time has changed. Like, he, at that time, I'm guessing they were like 15 years old, would ride his bike about 3 miles over to come kick it every single day. And he would get there like around 11 o'clock every day. I mean, it's just if we're 15 years old, nobody had jobs. We didn't have like a big set of responsibilities or anything like that. We were just chilling. So as we started, pretty much there's my house. This is on one side of the street. And on the other side of the street is Face's house. And the hangout spot was always either there between those two houses and then the park. Well, one day, Face was hanging out in his garage and Black and Rome were both there. And I saw them. I'm outside. I think I was like doing something like getting the mail or something. And they waved and, you know, I waved and said, hey, what's up? You know, and they're like, hey, come on over. So they waved me over. So I come on over there. I knew Face, but I didn't know Rome and Black. So when we introduced ourselves, we said, we chill. I'm the youngest one in the crew, obviously, which if you know anything about my life personally, you know that I'm usually, in most cases, leading up from that point up to a good point in my life, I was always the youngest person in the crew because I was always around older people. So we're sitting there, we're kicking it. And this is like right in the beginning of the summertime. They're sitting there with a boombox that has a tape in it. And they're sitting there playing things. And I'm sitting there wondering, like, hey, man, what y'all doing? They said, man, we just sitting here kicking it, man, listening to music and, you know, talking about music. And I'm sort of like sitting there listening to their conversation because I'm not really as into hip hop as they are, being as though they're a little bit older than me in high school. And they're sitting there playing a couple of different things. And the album that they were playing actually at that time was Poverty's Paradise by Naughty by Nature. And that's really the first time that I got into it. We sort of got in and dissected an album. And then this scene sort of replicated itself every single day. Well, a few days here and there during the summer that we didn't actually meet up. Replicated itself for a good portion of that summer. At times we would sit there. It would change from being at Face's garage to my garage to the park and down to the basketball court after playing basketball some days during that summer. And some other folks during the neighborhood would sort of be there, but the boombox would always be there, and there will always be tapes. As a matter of fact, Rome himself was a tape collector. He had with him along when he used to come along was always a backpack that had tapes and then always something from like the general store, like a Mystic or something like that as he rode his bike. So he used to have this backpack full of tapes and he would pull different things out during that particular time. And a lot of them were all things that came out during that time frame between 94 to 95. So one day we might be listening to Ready to Die. The next day we might be listening to Showing AG Goodfellas. Then other times it might be listening to Skee-Lo. I know. Other times it might be listening to Ghetto Boys or Gangstar. And then right in the middle of the summer, you had a lot of different tapes come out. And these is really what kind of got me locked in to the culture and had me hooked. Right around July, Bone Thugs came out with their debut long album or LP, which was East 99 Eternal. Now, I was already a big enough Bone fan being and starting middle school because they had pretty much ruled the music industry for my group in that particular area because middle schoolers loved Bone. They came out with this East 1999 Eternal. Then a week later, Rome comes up and pulls out a purple cassette tape and said, like, yo, this is Raekwon. Raekwon from Wu-Tang Clan album right here, man. This tape's purple. It's only built for Cuban Links, a.k.a. the purple tape. And I want to say we rocked with the purple tape probably for I want to say the rest of that summer. We really rocked with these 3 tapes during that particular time. The 3 ones that came out during that summer was East 99 Eternal, Only Built for Cuban Links, and then the last one was the show soundtrack, which came out in 95. The show, for those of you who don't remember, was a documentary that followed a lot of hip-hop artists that they were on tour, and, you know, it was like some of these like hip-hop documentaries. Another one was like Rhyme and Reason, where you got into like these real-life hip-hop situations. Was a big success back then among our demographic. But you got into the show soundtrack, which had a lot of good hits on there. And, man, we just really started really digging into it. And at this point, when I'm listening to this music every day, it's like, all right, I got to find enough money to get enough blank tapes to be able to get dubs. So my only job during that summertime was going and cutting grass. And I would probably get, like, at that time, like $25 a lawn. And where I lived at, our lawns were actually pretty big. So I could charge like $25-$30 a lawn, because there was a lot of hard work. I mean, even back then, I'm thinking, like, yo, I probably should have been charging more, but who cares? You know, you're the neighborhood kid. You're not a professional landscaper. You're trying to make a few bucks to be able to get some things that you want. So my big thing was in trying to get money was when I was hanging out with Rome and Face and Black, is like being and digging into these tapes. It's like, yo, all right, every time I used to get paid, I would run to, it would either be the CVS, or there would be Sam Goody or the Wiz or Tower Records. I would always go and shop to see who had the best blank tapes, Memorex, whatever kind of the blank tapes, to be able to get the best price on those so that I could go and get them and then bring them back. So it was almost like a bi-weekly sort of ritual at that point during that summertime. I would cut grass, I would get paid, and then I would go and buy blank tapes. And then I'd give like 5 blank tapes to Rome and be like, yo, dub me 5. What do you want? All right, this is what I want. And then sometimes every day for like maybe 3 or 4 weeks, he would come back with a new tape for me. And this is like before we had like the speed dubs, at least from what I remembered. I think you actually had to literally dub it and play and hit play and record. And that's how I got my tapes. Well, this was really my first collection of hip hop tapes before I actually started buying them on my own later on that year. So, and then this became my soundtrack when it came to me cutting grass, was listening to these tapes. Now, when I used to listen to these tapes, I used to always have my headphones on in my room because I couldn't play this out loud in my house. It was like doing the most sneaky stuff about stuff that really shouldn't have been sneaky in the first place. But that was that. As we listened to the music, I started getting into reading the magazines. I mean, I read the Source magazine, but I didn't really read it cover to cover like the way that I did being around these guys who are already into the hip hop culture. And I started watching the videos, not just as, you know, background noise or looking at it because videos are something to look at. I was really paying attention to the people who were in the videos, the women who were in the videos, and also, you know, what the concepts were like. Once I fully got immersed in the hip hop culture, I latched on and I never let go. Everything about me changed after that. Everything from the type of shows that I started to watch, to the music that I listened to the artists that I followed, to the magazines and stuff that I was reading. Like I was reading, you know, some stuff like Word Up and things like that. I was reading at that point, which was a very big one. And shout out to my college professor, Professor Frank Dexter Brown, who was the founder of YSB Magazine. I was reading that too, but then I was reading The Source. And eventually I started getting to more hip hop publications. And at that point, I was also starting to look onto the internet in the infancy of that time of hip hop publications, but finding what I could. I just dug as deep into the culture as I possibly could during that time. I was a hip hop fan before then. At that point, I was a full on junkie. Like I have a problem. That's the way that it was. Changed the way that I dressed. So I dressed a certain way when I was in the 7th grade. And when I was in the 8th grade, as well as spending money on blank tapes and also on magazines, I started saving up more money to be able to buy my own clothes. And I would also consult my older sisters, which I do have to say one of the clutch things about having older sisters during a time like that is that being able to get their input on fashion. Because women are always going to know what's in, and they know what other women like. Like, I didn't care about what the guys thought I looked like. I wanted girls to think I looked nice. So I came into my 8th grade year dressing a lot better than I did during my 7th grade year. And the way that my hair was cut was a little bit different too. Because I noticed how the guys' hair were cut, man, and when I used to look at videos, and the girls looked at me differently. It worked, man. It definitely worked. But at that point, once I saw that happen, I then went to a full-on, for the rest of 95, started to go into a full-on expedition and research for everything that I may have missed. And I was doing everything from asking, like, Face and asking Rome and Marcus. At this point, we were homeboys after we had spent the whole summer together, getting new things to listen to and things that I had missed from my prior years. And I was into a lot of acts before, but I was listening to the music with new ears at that particular time. It was really like opening up a new sense and being aware of the new sense all at the same time. It was like an overload. So that's how it started. This started my journey to being not just a consumer of hip hop music, but then also wanting to be a practitioner of it as well. Face, along with being into music, was probably the best person I knew personally that rapped at that particular time. He could flow, and he still can to this day. To me, I'd still tell him he's the best rapper that I know that he was one of the nicest MCs that I've ever been in contact with. And I really wanted to be like him. So I started, from that particular time, I started writing raps when I was in the 8th grade. And I started from there, and I just never let go and kept going and going and going. And that led to me also later on in my life, and when I was in high school, to want to learn how to produce. But it all started from this love of hip hop. And it all started back there in 95. And it wasn't just the albums that we listened to, it was the movies, it was watching the videos, it was reading the publications, it was being around other hip hop heads that got me latched, and I never let go. So that's my story. 95 is when it started it all. I mean, it's a time that I can sit back, and when I think about those times and I think about those garages and the parks and that boom box and those blank tapes, it was almost like I was like exchanging money for weed or crack. The blank tapes were the currency, and then the return blank tape with music on it was my crack. That's how it all started. All the way back in 95. And 95 was a great year of music. It had some great releases on it. You've heard a lot of them here on the Vault Classic Music Reviews. So I wanted to give you all perspective on what started me on this journey, what has led pretty much ultimately to this podcast being produced right now, which started back then, 25 years ago. And so that's the end of part 1. Now we're going to go into part 2, but we're going to take a little break. And in part 2, we're going to speak a little bit about 20 years ago and my relation with these 4 neo soul albums released in the year 2000, and in the context of me being in college and in that particular time of my life, how they shaped my life and continue to do so now even 20 years later. So we're going to take a quick little break, and after that, on the other side of it, we'll get right into it. And we are back here on the Vault Classic Music Review Podcast. Again, it's a throwback edition of Cards, Dominoes, Drinks, and Smoke. Just finished up part 1 and into part 2. And this is where I speak about the year 2000 and 4 releases in particular that came out during this year that really shaped me as a person and changed the way how I looked at neo soul. And 20 years from now, I'm still struggling to get to that apex of how that music made me feel, which is a bit interesting and also sad at the same time, if I could be honest. So let's go back now to the year 2000. Year 2000, 20 years ago, was actually the year that I graduated from high school. And I graduated from high school in June and headed to college that August at Morgan State University in Baltimore. During that particular time in that year in 2000, a lot of things happening. Things were all over the place when it came to me that year. I was finally an adult. I mean, I wasn't grown, but I was an adult. I can make a lot of decisions on my own. I was driving at that particular time. I had a car, and I was trying to make decisions as far as where I was going to go to school. I had a lot of places I was looking at. Sometimes I wanted to look at going out of state, but then also was like, maybe I should stay in state because it was cheaper for my parents and cheaper for me. And I was like, let's try to see if we can work a happy medium. I ended up choosing to go to Morgan, which is about an hour away from where I lived, around that time. And it was close enough that if I needed to get home, I could get home without too much trouble, but far enough away that I felt like I was actually away from home and could get the full college experience. So it was a lot of things happening at that time, getting ready to go to college and everything else. And during that time, I was really starting to get into music, and that's really when I started producing and making beats for the first time that year. My senior year in high school, I actually took a piano class taught by Miss Sally Burns. Shout out to Miss Burns, my music teacher, who taught me a lot of things that I knew about music and was very interested in me and developing my growth in playing the piano. I wanted to be able to learn to play chords and keys and learn more about music so that I could be a better beat maker. That's really my only motivation for learning piano at that time. Plus, it was an elective. And since I had electives to burn, I wanted to use it on something that I would enjoy doing. So I'm getting into music and producing, listening to music, and I'm into sort of like my artist who I like. And at this point, I'm well into my hip hop junkie journey, and things are starting to come out during that time. In the beginning of my senior year, you get these Mos Def's Black on Both Sides. You get this in Fraternal Affairs. You get Jay-Z's Volume 3, Life and Times of Sean Carter. And at the beginning of 2000, an album comes out from an artist that I hadn't heard from and seen in a while. It was D'Angelo. In the year of 2000, D'Angelo came out with his second album after a 5-year hiatus away from the music scene, Voodoo. Now, the one thing that everyone will remember about Voodoo during that time is really not the lead single, but the second single off of that album was a track called Untitled, aka How Does It Feel? And what everyone remembers about How Does It Feel is not that it was a remarkable song written by two great songwriters in D'Angelo and Raphael Sadiq, is that the video showed a mostly naked D'Angelo, and the thing that everybody was talking about was the video and how his body looked. And it became a huge, huge hit, partly based off of the fact that it was a great song, but then also based off of the fact that the video was something that every woman and person who liked to see something like that would want to see. But what got caught up in all the hoopla around How Does It Feel was the fact that that album was a life-changing album for me. I mean, listening to it, and also what I used to do a lot was read the liner notes of the albums to be able to see who produced what, to see who was doing this, like the mixing, and then also to see their acknowledgments. The acknowledgments in Voodoo were something different and something I'd never seen before. It was actually a foreword co-written by Saul Williams and D'Angelo that started to talk about the state of black music and how D'Angelo's approach in making this was all about making something that would be worthy of his journey as a musician and growth in the tradition of Jimi Hendrix, of Prince, of Curtis Mayfield, of Marvin Gaye, of all these different influences that he pulled from for his artistry. And it spoke to a lot of things about how music had really been talking about a lot of it, just a lot of the same bullshit, and that nobody was being creative anymore. And when you get into the album, for me, from track 1 to track 13, it was a nonstop whirlwind of just creativity, of emotion, of soul, of funk, it was just like, I didn't actually think that anybody could outdo much of what he had done on his debut album, Brown Sugar, which came out in 95. But they did. And to me, it was so much better than Brown Sugar that I was so blown away that this became my go-to CD for much of the first half of 2000. Well, I rotated between this and like Water for Chocolate, which by Common, which in relation to this, I'll get to this in just a second, the relationship between those two. But it was a life-changing album. What I try to tell people is like, listen, I know everybody's on How Does It Feel and, getting caught up in that. But like I'm telling people, yo, sit down and listen to the rest of this album. In 2000, age 18, sit down and listen to the rest of this album. I'm telling you, it's incredible. And 20 years now later, it's just as incredible now as it was then. I mean, at 18 years old, I was blown away that something could be so soulful, so funky, so provoking, something that it drew up emotions in you and feelings in you that you didn't think that somebody could have or feel. It was just amazing. And so that was really my soundtrack throughout most of the rest of the year. That and like Water for Chocolate. Now, I'll get into the relationship between those in just a second. So as we head into the year 2000 and as we go through the summertime and, you get into a lot of different music. And as you're heading into that music, going into that year when you're heading into college, you hear the soundtrack of a lot of different things that you'll hear at parties during your first parties of freshman year. At that time, Ja Rule was popping at that time. I remember, there was some tracks and stuff by like 112 and Beanie Man had come out with an album that time. He had that song with Girls Them Sugar with Maya. So that was a pretty big one. A lot of New York artists that were pretty big. Memphis Bleak was pretty big around that particular time. I remember he had a lot of hit songs out during that time. Jay-Z, obviously. As you get into that first year, during that summer, as you're heading into my first year at Morgan, comes Joe Scott's debut album. Who is Joe Scott? Words and Sounds Volume 1. And that album was crazy because I remember as being in DC, one of the first, actually the first single that I heard from Words and Sounds Volume 1 was It's Love. And the reason being is because it definitely had a go-go feel to it. With the beat and the live band and the backing, and it was upbeat. And that's really what, to me, kind of stuck into, oh, okay, this is a jam. And then you start getting into the other tracks on the album, the Getting in the Ways, the He Loves Me, the Is It the Way? And then this becomes a huge smash as we get heading into that year. And of course, it's Jilly from Philly. Anybody who knows anything about Baltimore and knows anything about Morgan is that there's a huge amount of folks from Philly who are there. So it was really a big buzz about her. So you have that come out. And then going into that year, there's another soul artist that comes out that has a huge smash on the radio that is starting to make some waves with a track called Just Friends. And this was Musiq Soulchild. As we get into the year, that track is really big. Then you start to hear other singles that come out from that album, and particularly the song Love, which became a huge hit amongst a lot of people when we were on campus. And then that album drops around October. And then people are copping this album. And what I noticed is that you would hear that everywhere. When I was walking around the dorm, I would hear people playing this. And as we said on our review of I Just Want to Sing, Music's debut album, you could hear that being played out of rooms in the boys' dorm where I lived at, and there wouldn't be any women in there. It would just be a vibe that you would really vibe to. That was another changing one as well, because it really was just like a really smooth, like something that a lot of, I think, guys and even people could relate to because it was so plainly stated and said. From there, what we also started to hear that year as we were coming into college and onto campus was Bag Lady by Erykah Badu. And later on that semester, as we headed into Thanksgiving, her album Mama's Gun comes out. And Mama's Gun, as you all know, as you just heard the last review that we did, is incredible album. I mean, this was another one that you would hear passing by, there wouldn't be any women in the room or nothing. It would be a vibe. These were the 4 neo soul albums that came out that really just made an impression on me during this time. So at one particular time when I was in school, I had my hardcore hip hop things I would listen to. I also copped like the MOP Warriors like CD when I was there. I had Big L's The Big Picture. You know, I was still pumping like Water for Chocolate. But then at one point in time in my rotation, it would be Voodoo, Words and Sounds Volume 1, I Just Want to Sing, and Mama's Gun, right there along with my rap CDs. And it would always be a great counterbalance to the things that I was listening to in one part versus what I was listening to on the other part. The balance was great because to me, I think it helped really just sort of balance this new environment of me being around new people, being in college, having to deal with, you know, a different set of circumstances. And that was really my soundtrack to start my college career. Along with everything else that was on the radio and things that you heard at parties, you didn't really hear a lot of neo soul stuff at parties. But the great thing about college is that neo soul and the artists that came along with them sort of started this subculture at black colleges. Now, if you were ever in colleges between the years 1998, between, I would say, like, say 2003, 2004, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Women wearing head wraps, people with the, you know, the Pan-African look, like Afrocentric looks, people wearing unks and, you know, with tattoos and chains and, you know, red, black, and green flags and things like very Afrocentric. You would have a group of students there on the campus that would really have that look on. And a lot of them were like, you know, into like neo soul music and into Dead Prez and things like that, you know. And it was an interesting aspect of being into college. Like, one of the great things about that neo soul movement in particular, like those albums in that time, is that was always present at a couple of things, at, like, you know, discussion forums and at open mics, poetry slams. It was almost like, yo, neo soul music was really like the default music in the soundtrack to poetry slams during that time, because you would always have it played during the break because it was always set a really nice mood, and it went with sort of like the things that were being said and the poetry that was being, you know, written and said at these events. So you sort of had that feeling to it as well. And all throughout, let's say I would from 2000 all the way up to like maybe 03, 04. And, you know, you had sort of like that subculture going. To speak about the three of the albums that are on here, at least the ones that I spoke of recently, Voodoo, Mama's Gun, and like Water for Chocolate were all part of, as we like to call, as I call them, the Soulquarian sessions at Electric Lady Studio, which happened between 1999 and 2000. These three albums were recorded together, like Water for Chocolate, Voodoo, and Mama's Gun, during the same sessions in Electric Lady Studio by a number of different producers and musicians who worked together on all three: James Poyser, Questlove, JD, aka J Dilla, the late J Dilla, great J Dilla, also Roy Hargrove, Pino Palladino, all these different musicians that worked during these Soulquarian sessions, that it would be people working in any particular room. And the synergy that you heard, the cohesion on these albums were made because they were all made pretty much in the same creative space, which was something that I still want to be able to make a documentary about these Soulquarian sessions, because I think the world at large needs to know about the greatness that happened in this studio for these three classic albums. I really do. You can tell the cohesion and that these albums were made within the same vein of creativity because of the feel of all three of those albums. And working in a classic studio like that, it just kind of adds to the mythology of those three albums as well. Now, reading and doing some research on this, because I always want to make sure that, you know, I'm not misinterpreting things as I was back then 20 years ago. But I read a couple of very good articles by writer Naima Cochrane, and she's a very great industry vet, writer, culture critic, creator. I mean, she's amazing. She does great work. She wrote about this earlier this year with Billboard about neo soul music in the year of 2000, and wrote an article called 2000, A Soul Odyssey. You know, play off the title of 2001, A Space Odyssey, you know, the movie. And in this article, she describes about the neo soul subgenre and how it fit into the rest of the music industry. And it really was, as you know, as a subgenre, which really came about in this particular generation amongst artists in the time frame between 95 and 98, where you had works like D'Angelo's Brown Sugar, Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite, Baduism, and then the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, that you really had this sort of like this rebirth of soul, neo soul, which really was a term that was coined by Peter Massenberg in the mid to late 90s to describe a rebirth of soul music within R&B, really getting back to the essence of what soul music was at its beginnings in generations before. But there was a period of time when popular R&B really took a foothold later on in the decade. But then by the year 2000 is where you had these 4 projects come out that really sort of put the neo soul music and subgenre right into the mainstream, where it was right there in front of your face. And for a brief time, there was a time when neo soul music really was viable in the mainstream. As we stated on the review we did for Joe Scott's album earlier this year, neo soul artists weren't just, making good music. They were commercially viable. They were selling albums and selling out tours. I remember seeing these tours for like Joe Scott and for Erykah Badu and for D'Angelo during that year. And I could go to a concert at that time, but I didn't have money to buy tickets. And I'm like, wow, this show sold out already. Look on the internet, Ticketmaster, this show sold out already. It was like that all over the country for them. It was such a popular set of music because I really think at that time it was speaking to a larger part of America that was starving for the soul to come back to the music, and they wanted to hear it in the music once again. And that's why I think it was so popular back then. That's the reason why I think it was so successful. So those albums come out, and then they set the stage for other neo-soul artists and for albums to come out that were successful. India Arie, Acoustic Soul, by Lau, Firstborn Second, Floetry's debut album. Artists like Rashawn Patterson, artists like Eric Roberson. I mean, lots and lots of other soul, neo soul artists, Aries, Selena Johnson, lots of artists that came afterwards. Heather Headley, really all kind of came from that particular time, where you saw where neo soul had that point in time from 95 to 98, and then from 2000 on, where they really started to flourish as a subgenre. And it really affected me because I think, to me, it was a breakup of, like D'Angelo said in his liner notes, everybody in music was talking about the same shit. But these neo-soul artists gave you something a little bit different that was like that break from the norm. You wanted to be able to get something that was that break from the norm, not the same old shit every single day. But then after that time period, it was almost as if the industry just sort of, neo-soul declined after that. And I think, as Naima wrote in her article, and as I've read in a couple of different articles this week, is that the decline of neo-soul music came from the fact that the subgenre and the title sort of put artists in a box that they couldn't escape from. And when you get sort of put in like, oh, such and such, this person, they're neo-soul, then all of a sudden people expect a certain type of music from you. And people think that when they hear that you're neo soul, and when they think and have connotations about neo soul music, they're going to think that it's going to be one thing versus something else. And then it's only going to be. So what it was is that it really was almost detrimental to the artist at some point, because what artistic growth does that show for, one, the non-fans that aren't necessarily fans of neo soul, that won't think that they'll give you a chance so that they could like you? Or what does it leave for the fans that love you and expect the same thing out of you, that if you decide that you want to grow and try something different, that you do, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, well, I don't like this new Erykah, I don't like this new music, I don't like this new D'Angelo or Jill, she changed or he changed. They're not doing the stuff that they used to do before. So I think that really aided to the decline of the subgenre overall. That's really what helped to bring neo-soul down. Nobody wanted to be put into a box to say you're a neo-soul artist and that's all that you do. Because then you really put yourself in that box, and if you can't escape, then you cannot succeed. And for me, I think it's interesting that it came about that way, and I think that it's sad too. because does it speak more to the artists themselves, or does it speak to us as an audience for not being able to be receptive to the changes that artists encounter on their journeys to grow, to change, to evolve, to adapt? Is it them for not being able to want to stick with what brought them? Or is it us for not wanting to expand our horizons to think that we can accept somebody for outside of what it is that we've always known about them? That's the biggest question, I think, more so than anything else. But for this listener, for those albums, for Voodoo, for Words and Sounds Volume 1, for I Just Want to Sing, and Mama's Gun, I'll do a ranking one of these days. But for my money, if I had it listed a top 5 right now, all 4 of these are probably in my top 5 of neo soul albums all time. If we talk about like the subgenre neo soul, probably in my top 5. And I could throw another one of these other ones in between then. And for me personally, I actually wish that some more neo soul artists would come out and would do, more music, the ones that I knew. But we also know there's a new neo soul artists who sort of come out who are doing music in that same vein, but not really being labeled as that. I mean, we hear people like Daniel Caesar, like Her, like SZA, like Ari Lennox and Summer Walker, like these new artists, Noah Allegra. Like we hear these artists now, these new artists that are sort of carrying on this same vein, but they're not having that same box of, quote unquote, neo soul. So this is the type of music that they make and who they are. No. They're sort of free of those restraints, and I do think that they're better off as a result of that. But I would love to see some of my favorites continue to make music, because that's the music to me that I think that really changed my outlook on the soul of music and how important it was for not just the artists themselves, but for us as fans to be able to realize that the soul is still there and it needs to be more of the forefront at this music and at this industry, which to me I think is losing more and more soul every day. And that's just my opinion. And there you have it, part 1 and part 2 of this throwback edition of Cards, Dominoes, Drinks, and Smoke. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hope that everybody had a safe and happy Thanksgiving. And as we move into this holiday season, please, y'all, be careful. And it's going to wrap up yet another edition of The Vault. Please make sure you check us out on our new host on Red Circle. You can also download, stream, and subscribe to The Vault Classic Music Reviews on any one of our streaming platforms. If you go to any one of our social media sites, you can get to the link tree in our bio. The link tree has all of our streaming sources and all of our social media channels. You can reach The Vault Classic Music Reviews on @VaultCMR Podcast, on @Vault Classic on Twitter, and on YouTube and Facebook, The Vault Classic Music Reviews Podcast. You can search that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page. Please keep up with us. Interact with us on social media and let us know what you think. Give us some of your memories of how you were a hip-hop junkie and then what you remember about that time in 2000 about neo-soul music. We love to interact with all of our fans. We do it here all for you. We appreciate all the support, and if you have a friend, tell a friend, and make sure that that friend tells a friend. Always remember to keep your headphones on and your music loud, but not too loud. And as we close, we like to remind everyone to dream big, because dreams are the basis for creation. Always create, innovate, and elevate, because you were never destined or created to stay stationary in this life. And on that note, we say peace.
Thank you for listening and coming into The Vault. Please subscribe and follow us on Facebook at IV Creative and Instagram at IVECRE8.